They always assume power lives in embossed titles or custom Wall Street suits. I know better. True power is holding the single routing key to a fragile empire. When our new chief executive demanded I hand over full core access, he had no idea. He just pulled the pin on a multi-billion-dollar time bomb. Hold your breath. I am about to show you why you never point a gun at the architect of your own bunker. Hello to our incredible listeners of Boss Revenge Stories. Thank you for always being here with us. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our channel's monetization, leaving us without the budget to keep operating, which means we must pause all new video uploads here for the foreseeable future and transition our work over to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's episode, please support us by joining our Patreon to experience exclusive, true revenge stories that are even better, significantly longer, and feature highly detailed situations we simply cannot publish on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors in a single story. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us dive into today's story, told through the eyes of Savannah Bell. I am 34 years old, and I am the chief architect of an independent technology firm I built from the absolute ground up, called Bellwether Dynamics. It was a bleak Tuesday night, though the raging storm violently battering my window made the actual time feel completely irrelevant. Chicago was currently drowning under a historic, record-breaking blizzard. The relentless wind howled against the reinforced glass of my high-rise apartment, sounding exactly like a dying animal in the dark, while the city power grid flickered weakly under the massive strain of the freezing temperatures. But my monitors never flickered. I was wide awake, my eyes locked onto the cascading green lines of code that kept a multi-billion-dollar empire breathing and moving. I am the sole creator and licensor of Nerve Center, a highly classified artificial intelligence system that manages the complex supply chain and operational routing for thousands of autonomous 18-wheeler trucks. These are not simple delivery vans, dropping off cardboard boxes at your front door. My autonomous trucks haul highly volatile chemicals, hazardous materials, and strictly regulated medical supplies across the entire country for Aegis Horizon Logistics, a corporate titan that relies entirely on my software to survive. At exactly 2:14 in the morning, the heavy silence of my apartment was completely shattered. My encrypted phone shrieked with a deafening red-level security alarm. The flashing emergency light painted my dark living room in violent, rhythmic bursts of crimson. My hands instinctively flew across the mechanical keyboard, bringing up the Global Defense Monitor. I fully expected to see a highly sophisticated cyber attack or a rogue state attempting to breach our external firewalls. But the threat was not coming from the outside. The terminal window displayed a glaring internal command. It was a master administrative override, and the origin IP address was pinging directly from the executive penthouse suite inside Aegis Horizon's own corporate headquarters. It was Marcus Vance. He was the newly appointed chief executive officer, a man handpicked by the board of directors and imported directly from Wall Street. His entire mandate was to ruthlessly restructure the company, artificially inflate its valuation, and sell Aegis Horizon Logistics to a massive global conglomerate before the end of the fiscal year. Marcus did not care about logistics, truck drivers, or the incredibly delicate balance of hazardous material transport. He only cared about his multi-million-dollar golden parachute. Right now, at 2:14 in the morning, this arrogant suit was attempting a brute force data extraction. He was trying to illegally clone the entire proprietary routing database of Nerve Center and migrate it to an untraceable offshore server. He wanted to package my life's work and intellectual property as his own internal asset to make the upcoming merger look infinitely more profitable to the buyers. What Marcus Vance fundamentally failed to understand was that he was not just breaching a standard corporate non-disclosure agreement. By attempting to unilaterally hijack the active routing data of federal chemical transports, he was directly violating the Federal Transportation Security Administration Act, not to mention the ironclad licensing agreement he had inherited when he took the corner office. Nerve Center was never designed to be a passive database. It was a living, breathing guardian, The very millisecond his unauthorized command hit the core router, my artificial intelligence retaliated. The system instantly blocked his extraction protocol, aggressively cross-encrypted every single byte of the routing data, and fired the intrusion logs directly to my secure terminal. I sat back in my worn leather chair and watched his access get violently rejected by my custom firewall. I did not panic. My heart rate did not even spike. Instead, I calmly stood up, walked over to my kitchen counter, and poured myself a heavy glass of cheap bourbon. The harsh burn in my throat was a comforting anchor against the sheer audacity of what had just unfolded on my screens. I returned to my desk, took a slow sip, and meticulously backed up the raw intrusion logs onto 3 separate, air-gapped physical hard drives. I slipped them into my fireproof safe and spun the dial. Then, with a few deliberate keystrokes, I quietly revoked all application programming interface access for the entire executive tier of Aegis Horizon. I locked the heavy iron doors to the castle from the outside. I finished my bourbon in the dark, knowing exactly what would happen when the sun came up. Tomorrow was going to be an absolute corporate bloodbath. The morning light was harsh and unforgiving, reflecting blindingly off the fresh mountains of snow that choked the downtown streets. I walked through the towering glass revolving doors of the Aegis Horizon corporate headquarters right at 8 o'clock in the morning. I did not even have time to reach into my coat to swipe my security badge. The moment my snow-covered boots hit the polished marble of the grand lobby, a dedicated team of 4 armed corporate security guards stepped out from the shadows near the reception desk. They did not say a single word, but their rigid posture made it incredibly clear I was no longer viewed as a valued partner. They immediately surrounded me, their faces stone cold, and escorted me straight past the front desk and into the private executive elevator. I stood in silence and watched the digital numbers climb higher and higher, 10, 20, 30, all the way up to the 40th floor. The heavy steel doors finally slid open to a sprawling corporate suite made entirely of transparent glass walls, imported Italian leather, and an atmosphere so freezing it practically reeked of cold money and dangerous desperation. The heavy oak door clicked completely shut behind my back, sealing me inside the executive boardroom. The sound was horribly final, like a massive bank vault locking into place. The sophisticated air filtration system above us hummed a low, sterile note, constantly pumping freezing air into a vast space already severely lacking in basic human warmth. Marcus Vance stood aggressively at the far end of a massive, custom-built mahogany table. He did not bother to offer me a seat. He did not even offer a standard corporate greeting. Instead, he simply picked up a thick stack of heavy legal paper and violently tossed it across the highly polished wood. It slid rapidly, coming to a dead halt right at the edge of the table, stopping mere inches from my cold fingertips. "Sign it right now," he demanded, his voice incredibly tight, clipped, and dripping with thinly veiled venom. I slowly glanced down at the top page. An official company directive required the prompt and absolute transfer of supreme system privileges, alongside the complete underlying codebase for Nerve Center. At the head of the page, printed in heavy black text, the feeble excuse merely cited an internal corporate reorganization. I did not reach out to touch the paper. I kept my hands casually buried deep inside the pockets of my long wool coat. I slowly looked up, meeting his frantic, aggressive stare with absolute, unwavering stillness. "No," I said. It was just one single word, but it hung suspended in the freezing atmosphere of the boardroom like a heavy drop of ice water balancing on the edge of a razor blade. Marcus blinked rapidly, his jaw tightening so violently I genuinely thought his perfectly capped teeth might crack under the immense pressure. "Excuse me?" he snapped, stepping threateningly out from behind his imposing executive leather chair. I said no. "Marcus, you seem to be operating under a fundamental, deeply flawed delusion regarding our professional relationship." I told him, keeping my vocal tone entirely even and completely devoid of emotion. "I am not one of your subservient corporate employees. I am an independent technology partner. Bellwether Dynamics owns every single line of that proprietary code. Furthermore, The sensitive routing data you pathetically attempted to steal at 2 o'clock this morning contains deeply restricted operational information. It is strictly protected by both the Federal Transportation Security Administration Act and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. I am legally bound by the federal government to keep unauthorized personnel, including the chief executive officer, locked entirely out of that architecture. The thick veins in his neck began to bulge noticeably against the stiff collar of his custom-tailored silk tie. He angrily marched down the length of the long table and slammed both of his hands flat onto the hard wood, leaning so far forward that his expensive designer cologne aggressively invaded my personal space. "Listen to me very carefully, you stubborn little mechanic," he hissed, his face rapidly flushing a dangerous, dark red. "Do you have any actual comprehension of how much money is sitting on this table right now? We are talking about an upcoming corporate merger worth over $3 billion. I have a massive legal department sitting just down the hall, equipped with over 200 of the most vicious, bloodthirsty corporate attorneys on the entire eastern seaboard. If you do not hand over those digital master keys right this very second, I will unleash every single one of them on your pathetic limited liability company. We will bury you in so much aggressive litigation that you will be paying off court fees until you are 90 years old. You are willfully obstructing the legitimate business operations of a multi-billion-dollar logistics giant, and I will personally crush you into absolute dust for it." I slowly shifted my gaze to the side of the room. Sitting quietly in the dark shadows at the extreme periphery were the chief legal officer and the director of human resources. They both looked absolutely terrified, like they were helplessly watching a horrible train wreck unfold in slow motion. The legal officer nervously cleared his throat, anxiously pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his heavily sweating nose. "Marcus, please, perhaps we should take a step back and thoroughly review the existing vendor agreements before we make any definitive, actionable legal threats," he stammered, his voice visibly shaking. The human resources director nodded frantically in desperate agreement, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she clutched her digital tablet tightly to her chest. Marcus did not even bother to look in their direction. He shot his right hand out through the cold air, silencing them immediately with a sharp, incredibly dismissive gesture. He waved them off like they were nothing more than annoying insects buzzing around his ears. "Shut your mouths, both of you," he barked loudly. "I am the chief executive officer of this entire corporation. My authority inside these glass walls is absolute. I do not care what some outdated, poorly drafted piece of paper says. Contracts are merely suggestions if you have enough capital to tear them to shreds in federal court. And Aegis Horizon has more than enough capital to wipe her completely off the map." I patiently let him finish his arrogant, unhinged tantrum, without breaking my cold eye contact with him for even a fraction of a second. I calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of my winter coat and pulled out a single, heavily folded document. It was the original vendor agreement, the sacred one bearing the physical, notarized signature of the actual company founder. I smoothly unfolded it and laid it perfectly flat on the mahogany table, right next to his ridiculous, unenforceable demand letter. I reached out and firmly tapped my index finger twice against paragraph 4, subsection B. "I highly suggest you read the Transportation Legal Guarantee Clause before you do something incredibly stupid and legally catastrophic," I told him quietly, letting the heavy silence of the room emphasize the weight of my words. "If you forcefully transfer the master administrative control of the hazardous material routing system to any party that does not hold an active federal certification, which you and your internal tech team absolutely do not, this company's entire corporate liability insurance policy is instantly and permanently invalidated. You will be flying completely blind with thousands of tons of highly dangerous, volatile chemicals constantly moving on public highways across all 50 states." Marcus aggressively snatched the paper from the table, staring at the designated clause for exactly 3 seconds before letting out a sharp, incredibly arrogant sneer. He genuinely believed I was bluffing. He thought I was just using scary legal jargon to desperately save my highly lucrative consulting contract. In his warped, money-obsessed mind, He saw me as just another desperate contractor desperately clinging to her monthly paycheck. In a blind fit of pure, unadulterated Wall Street hubris, he reached into his finely tailored breast pocket and aggressively pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. "You are officially terminated," he declared loudly, clearly relishing the authoritative sound of his own voice aggressively echoing off the transparent glass walls. He viciously scribbled his signature across a formal cancellation of service order and slammed it down onto the table so hard the heavy wood vibrated. "Bellwether Dynamics is permanently done here. Your contract is completely shredded as of this exact second." He abruptly turned his back on me and snapped his fingers sharply at the armed corporate security guards standing silently outside the glass wall. "Take her security badge right now, escort her completely out of the building, and make sure she never sets foot on this private property ever again." He calmly adjusted the sharp lapels of his suit jacket, wearing a horribly smug, victorious smile on his face, completely and utterly convinced that he had just brilliantly won the war. I did not fight them. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not offer Marcus the satisfaction of a dramatic, emotional exit. I calmly unclipped my heavy plastic security badge from the lapel of my coat, placed it gently on the polished mahogany table, and turned my back on the chief executive officer. The armed guards escorted me back to the executive elevator in total, suffocating silence. The descent from the 40th floor felt incredibly peaceful. When the heavy steel doors finally opened into the grand lobby, I did not head for the main exit to face the freezing blizzard raging outside. Instead, I took a sharp right turn and walked straight into the high-end corporate cafe located on the ground floor of the building. The barista looked exhausted, wiping down the marble counter with a damp cloth. "One large dark roast Americano, please," I said quietly, handing him a crisp $10 bill. I took my steaming cup of coffee and sat down at a small corner table that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the main security turnstiles and the executive elevator banks. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my personal smartphone, and opened the clock application. I set a highly specific countdown timer for exactly 15 minutes and pressed start. The digital numbers began to fall. 14 minutes and 59 seconds. 14 minutes and 58 seconds. I took a slow sip of the scalding black coffee and let my mind methodically visualize exactly what was happening 40 floors above my head. I knew the internal corporate IT team was already swarming the boardroom like desperate scavengers. I could perfectly picture Marcus barking aggressive orders, demanding his severely underpaid engineers plug their flash drives into the main terminal to bypass my security walls and siphon the core data. To do that, they would inevitably log into the Human Resources portal first to officially process my termination and attempt to revoke my administrative rights. That was their fatal, irreversible mistake. The exact millisecond the Human Resources database updated my employment status to terminated, the master administrative token associated with Bellwether Dynamics was forcibly severed from the central architecture. When that connection snapped, it did not just lock the internal servers with a standard password wall. It triggered a deeply embedded, highly classified safety protocol I had specifically engineered into the absolute bottom layer of the code. It was a digital deadman switch. You see, Nerve Center was never a standard commercial IT database. You do not just write a basic inventory script when you are responsible for moving highly reactive industrial chemicals, liquid nitrogen, and radioactive medical isotopes across state lines. The system was intrinsically hardwired directly into the real-time monitoring grids of the United States Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency. The federal government strictly mandated that a certified, vetted architect had to hold the operational key at all times to ensure absolute accountability by officially firing me and severing my credentials. Marcus did not just perform an aggressive corporate restructuring. He effectively removed the only federally authorized pilot from the cockpit of a massive, heavily loaded commercial airliner mid-flight. The internal logic gates of the artificial intelligence did not possess human nuance. It did not care about corporate mergers, golden parachutes, or arrogant executives from Wall Street. It only processed binary survival protocols. Protocol Sigma 9 was designed to prevent a rolling bomb scenario. With no recognized architect at the helm, the artificial intelligence instantly determined that Aegis Horizon Logistics had suffered a hostile, catastrophic cyber hijacking. The system assumed terrorists had breached the mainframe and were attempting to weaponize thousands of tons of hazardous materials. 8 minutes left on my timer, all across the United States, from the sun-baked stretches of Interstate 10 in Arizona to the heavily snowed overlanes of Interstate 90 in upstate New York. An unprecedented logistical phenomenon began to occur. More than 2,500 autonomous 18-wheeler trucks simultaneously received a Priority 1 emergency broadcast overriding all previous routing instructions. These were massive, 80,000-pound machines carrying highly corrosive acids, deeply volatile compressed gases, and critically sensitive organ transplant equipment. At 70 miles per hour, the central computers bypassed the local driving algorithms. Massive diesel engines abruptly cut their own throttles. Brilliant amber and glaring red hazard lights began flashing in perfect, terrifying synchronization across thousands of miles of public asphalt. Heavy air brakes hissed violently, a deafening mechanical scream echoing across the country. As the massive rigs automatically engaged their emergency collision avoidance systems, they flawlessly executed their safety programming, safely but firmly pulling themselves over onto the muddy shoulders of the federal highway system. Once the heavy tires stopped rolling, the digital dead man's switch executed its final, devastating command. It permanently engaged the pneumatic parking brakes and initiated a full mechanical lockout on every single engine block. The heavy steel cabin doors sealed shut with audible hydraulic clicks, completely locking out any physical human intervention from the outside. The internal temperatures of the refrigerated medical trailers locked themselves into a secure, self-sustaining stasis mode, drawing power directly from the solar backups to keep the cargo from spoiling. At the exact same moment, inside 75 different massive fulfillment warehouses across the country, the chaos was equally deafening. Thousands of automated sorting drones simply dropped their packages right where they were hovering, descended rapidly to the cold concrete floors, and entered a deep, unresponsive hibernation state. The massive robotic arms that loaded the pallets froze mid-swing. A multi-billion-dollar supply chain empire was completely and utterly frozen in less than 60 seconds. The lifeblood of American industrial transport had just suffered a massive, artificial stroke. 3 minutes left on my timer. Back up on the 40th floor. The absolute silence of the boardroom was violently shattered. I could not physically hear the noise from the lobby, but I knew the exact choreography of the disaster because I had written the alert protocols myself. Marcus's personal cell phone would ring first, emitting a high-pitched federal tone, then the heavy desk phones, then the private emergency lines of the legal officers. Frantic regional dispatchers from every single state would be screaming through the receivers, desperately reporting that their entire fleets had just died on the side of the road and were completely unresponsive to manual overrides. Major pharmaceutical clients and industrial chemical manufacturers would be bombarding the switchboards, demanding immediate answers as tens of millions of dollars of highly sensitive freight stopped moving completely, burning through massive financial penalties by the minute. But the angry clients were not the actual problem. The real nightmare arrived precisely when my digital timer hit 0. Down in the lobby, I watched 3 men in dark suits and federal badges violently push their way through the glass revolving doors, ignoring the security desk entirely. The Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency had just dispatched an automated Priority 1 crisis alert to the corporate headquarters. The federal government was demanding an immediate, sworn explanation as to why the National Hazardous Material Transport Network had suddenly been stripped of its administrative security protocols. Sitting in his freezing, glass-walled penthouse, Marcus Vance was finally realizing the horrific magnitude of his arrogance. The $3 billion merger he was desperately trying to secure was currently evaporating into thin air. No corporate buyer on earth would touch a logistics company that had just triggered a national security incident. Worse than the collapsing deal was the ticking clock hanging directly over his own head. The nerve center architecture required my specific, heavily encrypted biometric thumbprint every 12 hours to authorize the continuous transport of federal hazmat loads. Without it, the company would remain permanently paralyzed. He had forcefully removed the only person on the entire planet who could unlock the trucks. Marcus was no longer looking at a simple breach of contract lawsuit. I was staring straight down the barrel of a multi-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for criminal negligence and reckless endangerment of national security infrastructure. I finished the last cold drop of my Americano, gently placed the empty paper cup on the small wooden table, and leaned back in my chair. I simply watched the elevator banks, waiting patiently for the frantic, heavily sweating corporate executives to come running back down to beg me for salvation. Up in the penthouse, an emergency board of directors meeting was violently and hastily convened over a highly secure video conference link. The screens lit up with a dozen high-definition feeds of ultra-wealthy investors, aggressive private equity vultures, and legacy corporate shareholders. They were calling in from the back seats of luxury sedans in Manhattan, private golf resorts in Aspen, and sun-drenched yachts anchored off the coast of Monaco. But right now, none of that immense generational wealth could buy them a single ounce of oxygen. The atmosphere in the digital room was thick with absolute, suffocating panic. The company's internal valuation, normally traded quietly on the gray market among institutional investors, was currently falling in a sheer vertical drop. They were losing hundreds of millions of dollars in hypothetical market capitalization with every single passing breath. Their heavily guarded private shares were suddenly worth less than the imported mineral water they were nervously sipping. Marcus Vance stood at the head of the mahogany table, sweating entirely through his custom-tailored Italian shirt. He was frantically pacing back and forth, pointing an accusatory finger at the expensive camera lens mounted on the wall. "She is a rogue operative," he screamed, his voice cracking under the immense, crushing pressure. "That so-called architect is an absolute cyber-terrorist. She deliberately planted a malicious digital virus in our mainframe out of pure spite, because I was aggressively restructuring her bloated consulting contract. I want the Federal Bureau of Investigation on the phone right now. I want her arrested for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and the deliberate destruction of private company property." The chief legal officer, who was still standing in the dark corner of the boardroom, physically stepped forward. He looked exactly like a man who was preparing to walk directly into a military firing squad. He raised both of his trembling hands, aggressively cutting off the chief executive officer mid-rant. "Marcus, you need to shut your mouth immediately," the lawyer practically begged, his terrified voice echoing loudly over the state of the art conference speakers. "Do not call federal law enforcement. If you call the Federal Bureau of Investigation right now, they will absolutely arrest someone, but it will certainly not be her. It will be you." The massive video grid of aggressive billionaires went instantly silent. The legal officer violently pulled at his expensive silk collar, visibly struggling to breathe in the heavily air-conditioned room. "I just got off the emergency phone line with our highest-level contacts at the Department of Transportation. Savannah Bell did not hack us. She did not deploy a virus or a Trojan horse. Her software acted exactly according to the strict federal compliance protocols she filed with the United States government 3 years ago, when you unilaterally signed her termination papers and aggressively forced her off the premises. You legally severed our only authorized administrative tether. You turned Aegis Horizon Logistics into a massively unlicensed, highly illegal rogue operator. The artificial intelligence shut itself down to prevent us from committing a colossal federal crime." The resulting explosion of wealthy, entitled outrage was completely beautiful to imagine. The board members immediately began tearing each other apart like starving wolves trapped in a gold-plated cage. The elegant, sophisticated veneer of high society collapsed in a fraction of a second. An 80-year-old venture capitalist from Boston started screaming heavy profanities so loudly his microphone severely distorted into static. A ruthless hedge fund manager in London vehemently demanded Marcus be thrown physically out of the nearest glass window. They suddenly realized the brutal, undeniable truth. Marcus Vance, the supposed Wall Street genius they had aggressively recruited to artificially inflate the company's value, had just thrown their entire $3 billion empire into a high-speed industrial wood chipper, and he did it entirely because his massive, fragile ego could not handle a single word of defiance from a brilliant woman who clearly understood the rules of the game better than he did. The board of directors issued one frantic, unified directive: go downstairs and get her back right this instant. Exactly 4 minutes later, the chief legal officer came practically sprinting out of the executive elevator bank in the ground floor lobby. He looked absolutely frantic, desperately scanning the massive open area until he finally spotted me sitting quietly in the corner cafe. He rushed over to my small wooden table, completely out of breath, his expensive tie hanging crookedly around his neck. I did not look up right away. I calmly picked up a freshly baked butter croissant, pulled it gently apart, and took a small, deliberate bite. The flaky pastry was warm and absolutely delicious against the cold, stressful morning. "Savannah, please," the lawyer gasped, tightly grabbing the back of the empty chair opposite me to physically support his shaking body. "You have to come back upstairs right now. We will completely tear up the termination notice immediately. We will double your monthly retainer. We will triple it if that is what it takes. Just please, I am begging you. Log back into the mainframe and unlock those trucks before the federal authorities start issuing permanent corporate cease and desist orders." I chewed my croissant slowly, swallowed deliberately, and finally looked him dead in the eye. "I cannot do that," I said smoothly, keeping my voice completely devoid of any human sympathy or warmth. "I have absolute zero administrative authority on your servers. The chief executive officer formally and legally terminated my contract. My biometric credentials are mathematically dead. If I attempt to forcefully log into that federal system right now, I would be committing a severe federal felony. I am deeply sorry. But your boss made his incredibly stupid decision, and now you all have to live with the consequences." The lawyer looked as if he was going to physically collapse onto the polished cafe floor. "Then what do we do?" he pleaded, his voice severely reduced to a pathetic, terrified whisper. "How do we possibly fix this disaster?" "You only have two viable options left on the table," I explained coldly, gently wiping my fingers on a small paper napkin. "Option 1 is that Aegis Horizon builds a brand new, fully compliant artificial intelligence routing system entirely from scratch, given the current suffocating regulatory environment. That will take your engineers roughly 5 years and cost approximately $1 billion in research and development. Assuming, of course, the company magically survives the massive federal fines accumulating by the millions as we speak." I paused for a long moment, intentionally letting the sheer, terrifying impossibility of that financial option sink deeply into his panicked brain. I continued, lowering my voice to a sharp, uncompromising whisper. "You find the one person on this earth who holds a higher foundational authority than your arrogant chief executive officer. You need the actual architect of this entire corporation to fundamentally rewrite the current operational order, because Marcus Vance is a dead man walking, and I do not negotiate with corpses." I followed the completely defeated chief legal officer back into the high-speed executive elevator. We ascended to the 40th floor in absolute suffocating silence. When the heavy steel doors finally slid open, the chaotic screaming echoing from the glass-walled boardroom was physically deafening. I did not take my original seat at the massive mahogany table. I simply stepped quietly inside the room, crossed my arms over my chest, and leaned back against the cold glass wall, waiting for the inevitable climax of this corporate disaster. The board of directors had reached their absolute breaking point. The massive digital screens surrounding the room displayed a terrifying sea of red financial indicators, confirming that millions of dollars were hemorrhaging from their collective net worth with every passing second. There was only one emergency protocol left in their arsenal: the corporate secretary, her hands trembling so violently she could barely type, walked over to the secure communications console at the center of the table. She carefully inputted a highly classified, 24-digit alphanumeric sequence into the terminal. It was a direct, encrypted satellite uplink. They were calling Julian Thorne. Julian was the legendary founder and original architect of the Aegis Horizon Empire. He was a rugged, uncompromising visionary who had built this massive logistics network out of pure grit and exhaust fumes. Exactly 6 years ago, he had permanently stepped down from his role, completely retiring from the toxic corporate world. He retreated to a massive, heavily isolated ranch, deeply hidden within the brutal, snow-capped mountains of Montana. He had not stepped foot inside a boardroom, nor had he weighed in on a single executive decision in over 2,000 days. The encrypted connection hissed and crackled loudly over the high-definition speakers. The entire room of frantic billionaires and aggressive hedge fund managers immediately froze, completely holding their collective breath. Through the pristine audio feed, you could hear the raw, violent howling of a Montana blizzard, followed closely by the heavy, distinct sound of thick wooden logs popping in a massive stone fireplace. "Speak!" Julian commanded. His voice was incredibly deep, echoing with a gravelly, authoritative weight that instantly commanded the entire room. It was completely stripped of any standard corporate pleasantries. Marcus Vance practically lunged across the mahogany table toward the central microphone. His designer suit was heavily wrinkled, and his forehead was shining with thick, cold sweat. He frantically launched into a highly manipulated, desperate version of the morning's events. He tried to project a tone of decisive leadership, but his voice was shaking with undeniable terror. He painted me as a rogue, emotional contractor who was deliberately sabotaging the entire company over a minor contract dispute. He aggressively pleaded with the founder, practically begging Julian to invoke his supreme executive veto power to forcefully override my digital locks and save the $3 billion merger. When Marcus finally stopped speaking, he was gasping for air. Then came the silence. Julian did not immediately respond. For nearly a full minute, the only sound filling the freezing boardroom was the ambient crackle of the fire radiating from the Montana ranch. The psychological weight of that silence was absolutely crushing. Marcus was visibly shaking, desperately wiping the heavy sweat from his eyes. Instead of flying into a furious rage at the catastrophic disruption of his legacy, Julian took a slow, deep breath. "Marcus," the founder finally said, his tone ominously calm, "I want you to open the primary master vault file on your terminal. Locate the original vendor licensing agreement between Aegis Horizon and Bellwether Dynamics, the one with my physical signature on it." Marcus frantically tapped on his sleek tablet, his fingers slipping against the glass screen until he pulled up the scanned document. "Now," Julian instructed, his voice echoing like cold thunder across the room. "Turn to page 42. I want you to look at Appendix D, and I want you to read Clause 8 out loud for the entire board of directors to hear." I watched a terrifying, ghostly pallor wash completely over Marcus's face as his eyes scanned down the digital page. The clause he was looking at was not drafted by a team of expensive corporate lawyers. It was written by Julian and myself, nearly 10 years ago, while we were sitting on overturned milk crates in a freezing, unheated garage in Southside Chicago. We had specifically designed that exact clause to protect the company from greedy, arrogant executives, exactly like Marcus Vance. "Read it, Marcus," Julian commanded, completely dropping the polite tone. "Read the damn words." Marcus swallowed hard, his throat making a loud, audible clicking noise. He gripped the edges of the tablet so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. Any unauthorized attempt to bypass, extract, or directly interfere with the core routing architecture of the nerve center system, without the express cryptographic authentication of Bellwether Dynamics, shall be strictly classified as an act of severe industrial sabotage. Marcus read aloud, his voice dropping to a weak, pathetic whisper. He paused, looking completely sick to his stomach as his eyes fell upon the second sentence. "Finish it," Julian demanded coldly. "In the event of such a breach," Marcus choked out, "the sitting chief executive officer shall automatically and immediately forfeit all executive authority regarding supply chain management, and their operational credentials shall be permanently revoked." The absolute silence in the boardroom returned, but this time it was suffocating. Every single billionaire on the video screens stared at Marcus with pure, unadulterated disgust. Julian Thorne did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True power, never has to shout. Marcus, you were hired to simply polish the silver and sell the company, not to blow the entire house to pieces, the founder judged, his tone cutting through the room like a jagged piece of ice. You walked blindly into a highly sensitive, federally regulated ecosystem, and you arrogantly stepped on a massive landmine purely out of your own profound ignorance. You are a complete liability. Before Marcus could even open his mouth to offer a pathetic defense, Julian delivered the final, ruthless execution. He addressed the silent grid of wealthy shareholders. To the board of directors, hear my exact orders. Effective immediately, you will indefinitely suspend Marcus Vance from all executive duties and physically remove him from the premises. Furthermore, you will instantly reinstate Savannah Bell. You will accept any and all financial conditions she puts on that table to bring the trucks back online. You will give her absolute whatever she wants, right this second, before the Department of Transportation finds this entire corporation into permanent bankruptcy. Do not call this number again. The satellite connection terminated with a sharp, heavy digital click. The sound echoed off the glass walls, leaving Marcus Vance standing completely paralyzed at the head of the table, entirely stripped of his power, his dignity, and his billion-dollar future. I stepped fully away from the cold glass wall and walked slowly back toward the center of the massive mahogany table. I was no longer the dismissed independent contractor being escorted out by armed guards. I was the singular pulse keeping this entire corporate organism alive. Marcus Vance had completely collapsed into his expensive leather chair. His pristine Wall Street posture was completely gone, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a man who had just watched his entire professional existence evaporate into thin air. He had been thoroughly stripped of his operational authority, his dignity, and his leverage. I reached into my bag and pulled out my encrypted laptop. I set it down directly in front of the secure communications console, opened the heavy lid, and reached into my pocket for a small, heavily encrypted biometric flash drive. I inserted it into the port and pressed my thumb firmly against the glowing glass sensor. The system authenticated my identity in a fraction of a second. The red emergency indicators on the massive boardroom screens instantly shifted back to a calm, steady green. Out on the freezing highways of America, the great unfreezing began. 2,500 autonomous engines simultaneously roared back to life, their heavy diesel blocks shaking off the forced hibernation. The flashing hazard lights along the interstates turned off. The hydraulic brakes released their tremendous pressure, and the massive trucks slowly merged back into the moving lanes of traffic. Deep inside the fulfillment centers, thousands of delivery drones powered up and took to the air, while robotic arms seamlessly resumed sorting their designated pallets. The vital logistics network was instantly revived, like fresh blood pumping violently back into a massive, dormant heart. I did not look at the screens. I reached back into my bag and pulled out a freshly printed, heavily modified service agreement. I tossed it onto the polished wood, letting it slide smoothly until it stopped perfectly in front of the chief legal officer. "These are my new terms," I stated, my voice completely steady and totally devoid of any negotiation. "My monthly maintenance and architectural retention fee is now exactly 3 times the previous amount. Furthermore, I have added a new addendum. Bellwether Dynamics now retains absolute, permanent veto power over any and all data sharing or migration initiatives regarding the impending merger with Omnicorp. I alone decide what data leaves my servers, and I decide who gets to look at it." The board members on the video screens did not utter a single word of protest. They did not attempt to negotiate the massive price increase or the unprecedented loss of executive control. The chief legal officer practically dove for his heavy gold pen. He hastily scribbled his signature across the bottom line, permanently binding the corporation to my exact architecture. Marcus Vance slowly stood up. He did not look at me. He did not look at the board of directors. The sheer arrogance of the Wall Street elite had been completely and utterly crushed by a woman who simply understood the actual rules of the game far better than he ever could. He quietly gathered his expensive tablet and his gold pen, turned around, and walked out of the glass boardroom in complete, humiliating silence. An hour later, I was completely alone inside the secure, climate-controlled server room located deep in the basement of the building. The rhythmic, soothing hum of the massive server racks was the only sound in the freezing air. I stood there, quietly reflecting on everything that had just transpired. I did not engineer that massive shutdown to prove a petty point, and I certainly did not do it out of some desperate need for personal revenge. I did it because I understand exactly how the real world operates. In a corporate landscape driven entirely by ruthless greed and bottomless ambition, your professional survival does not come from empty promises, friendly handshakes, or verbal reassurances. True survival comes strictly from the ironclad, undeniable structural defenses you build with your own two hands. Titles are just words printed on business cards to scare the faint-hearted. True power never needs to shout. True power is the deadbolt locked tight on blood and bone contracts. Sometimes, the most terrifying refusal is the exact and only way to keep your world from being burned to the ground by someone else. Thank you so much to all of our amazing listeners for tuning in and staying until the very end of today's episode. I would love to know, where in the world are you currently listening to this story from? Please let me know down in the comments. As I mentioned earlier, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization, which leaves us without the necessary budget to keep this channel running. Therefore, we will absolutely not be uploading any new videos here in the foreseeable future, and we are officially moving all of our operations over to Patreon. If you enjoyed today's story and want to help us survive, please support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon. There, you can listen to the absolute best, highly exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join right now by scanning the Patreon QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the direct link provided in the description or the pinned comment below. Thank you for your incredible support, and I will see you over on Patreon.